The County Seat is brought to you this week by Jones and DeMille Engineering, helping to shape your quality of life. Find out more at jonesanddemille.com.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the County Seat. I'm your host, Chad Booth. Today we are sitting down for a conversation for the entire half hour with the new director for the state of Utah for the Bureau of Land Management, Greg Sheehan. Greg, thank you for taking the time to talk to us.
Thank you, Chad. It's nice to join you again. It's been a few years, but it's good to be back with you and spend a little bit of time with the county seat today.
Let's talk a little bit about your path and your expertise and how it relates to your job today and getting back here to head the BLM in the state of Utah.
Sure. When I got out of college, I went to Utah State University. I was with the Air Force for a few years up at Hill Air Force Base, and then had an opportunity to come join the Utah Department of Natural Resources. So when I came to the Utah DNR, I for a number of years served in the administration there. So I worked in some oversight roles that dealt with all of the different agencies, parks and wildlife and oil, gas and mining and forestry and the water agencies. So I had a pretty good exposure to a variety of natural resource areas there and how those processes worked. And then was asked to join Division of Wildlife Resources and spent quite a few years there. And then ultimately, my last 5 years or so, I served as the director of the Division of Wildlife. So that was quite an honor, and here within the state. And then eventually was asked to join the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service back in Washington, D.C. So that was a big change, a big move. You mentioned visiting with me at my going away party when I left the Division of Wildlife here in Utah and went back to Washington. Spent some time there, and throughout this journey that ultimately led to my being here with the Bureau of Land Management, it's really been wonderful. I have a great love of natural resources, a really great love of our state of Utah, and it's been a good journey, and I've learned a lot, and I think all of these agencies have been very intertwined and intertangled in a positive way, whether federal or state.
Do you think that being on both sides of that relationship between federal land management and state management and some of the areas that you've dealt with, do you think that helps you in this role?
I absolutely do, Chad, and I think that's a good point you bring up is what rule book do we work off of, right? In the state, we have certain laws that are created by the legislature and the Utah Wildlife Board, when I was with DWR, that we operated within. And then when I was with the federal government, both the Fish and Wildlife Service and now, we sort of have a different set of rules that we work within. Here at BLM, it's called FLPMA is the acronym, but it's the Federal Lands Policy Management Act, and that was enacted in 1976. And that's kind of the rule book that we work with here. But the underlying tenets of what we deal with, these land management issues, whether they're how we address restoration and fire prevention on public lands, whether it's the wildlife issues, whether it's any number of other natural resource issues, all of those live at any of these agencies that I've been involved with. But you're right. We do have a little bit different rule book that we have to, play within, so to speak.
The rule book here is much bigger than the one at the state. I saw your homework that you walked in with this morning.
Yeah. I mean, certainly the federal framework is large, right? But there's a reason for that, I think, too. When we talk about our public lands here, there's so many users that view these lands in so many different ways and how they could be used, that I think that really is what's grown to these big rule books, if you will, or these laws that govern how we conduct our business. And I think it's important, and I think that our public expects us to have a pretty broad framework and set of conditions and ideas that we all have to understand and work within.
How do you deal with the challenges of some of those groups? And you know, you haven't been on the path a long time here in this position, but it seems like in review of this, somebody's always unhappy with the BLM, and you know, it tends to shift, and you know, the ranchers and resource people get happy, and the environmental and recreation people get unhappy, and then some of the recreation people jump back with the ranchers, and you've always got this divide. But how do you find a middle ground? Because I haven't seen it yet.
It's difficult, but I think that's what we aspire to do well, which is take choices that sometimes may be very binary in nature, right? If you make one happy, you make another one upset. Certainly we dealt with that Division of Wildlife, and we talked about rules of how we address hunting or fishing. We deal with that, you know, here at the state BLM. And at times, yes, it is difficult. When we say groups, you know, there are those who value these lands because they generate a livelihood for individuals who may be involved with oil or gas or mining or grazing. And there are folks, as well as guiding, there are other folks who maybe view this as, you know, how do we have recreation opportunities? How do we enjoy these natural and wild places? And, you know, who's wrong, who's right? Probably a little bit of both for all of us at all times, but it is a balancing act. And I think what we try to do, first of all, is listen. If there's one thing I've learned and really believe strongly in government over this many years, nearly 30 years that I've been involved with natural resource management, is it's important to listen, because people aren't, you've pointed out, it always seems like we have this dichotomy that people can't be made happy. But, and maybe that's true in many cases, but we got to listen, because people know they're not always going to get their way in life, but they get very frustrated if you won't spend the time and listen and hear them out and try to figure out ways to incorporate their thoughts into it.
So there have been some policy changes that about the process of coming up with planning, and I briefly talked to Secretary Bernhardt about this a few weeks ago, but a policy change on how parties come to the table when they're deciding plans going forward and what elements need to be included. Do you think this will improve this process?
Well, I think that one of the frustrations that's been out there for many years are the decision-making matrix, or NEPA as we call it, the National Environmental Policy Act, which says here's how federal agencies have to make decisions and the steps that we go through to get from here to here. And one of the frustrations I think that have been out there by proponents who've asked for things, whether that's a high transmission power line that crosses the state, or any number of other things, a wild horse and burro gather, these processes. But some of the biggest ones, these what we call environmental impact statements that we go through, have taken sometimes many, many years, 10 or 12 years to work through a process. And it's created frustration because sometimes these applicants may not have 10 or 12 years to work through a process, and it can be very expensive. So what he said is we need to condense the length of these, condense the time frame that these are created in, and get out and make a decision based on the best information that we can, based on public feedback that comes to us through a number of ways in these processes, and get it out in front of people and be able to make a decision and then move on from there. So yeah, I think that's been helpful for our organization. It certainly creates a resource demand at times as we kind of focus quickly on these projects, but it allows us then to move on to other work that we need to do. So yeah, I think that will be helpful as an agency as we move forward.
Well, let's talk about some of those issues that have to run through NEPA and other things like that. We'll come back with a conversation with Greg Sheehan, the State Director of the BLM, here on the County Seat right after this commercial break. Welcome back to the County Seat. We are talking today with Greg Sheehan, the State Director for the Bureau of Land Management here in Salt Lake City at his office. There are issues that always seem to perennially be on the table with the BLM and other land agencies, and two of them that have been particularly important to us this year have been the wildfire situation and obviously wild horses. So let's talk about the wild things for a few minutes.
Okay, good. I have a little bit of background on the wild things, so glad to talk about that.
Yeah, let's start with the wild horse situation and move on to wildfire.
Sure. Wild horses are a topic that's been around really for decades now. And how do we best manage that? There are so many advocates for our wild horses and burros. People love wild horses and burros. They want to go see them in their natural ranges. They want to know that they're going to be there for future generations. But at the same time, we have a responsibility to manage those within the appropriate management levels, or AMLs. And those are what's determined to, how many horses can be on the range, not only for the health of those animals themselves, but for others that share these landscapes, the public land, livestock, grazers, the wildlife, the deer and the elk and others. So, there's limited amounts of food and sometimes access to water out in these areas. So we were fortunate that Congress brought some additional funding to help manage some of these animals. When we started into this year, our AML, our objective, if you will, for these wild horses and burros on our public lands was around 2,000 animals. We had about 7,500 here in Utah. With some of these extra funds that we've been able to receive this year, we've been, by the first part of December, we've been able to bring about 2,500 horses and burros off of the range, so we'll be down to around 5,000 animals. And then those ones we brought off the range will have opportunities to be adopted by those who want to take them into their homes and have them become one of their family members. So we've had good success with that.
I'm not sure that they want them in their home.
Right. Good point. Perhaps not in their houses, but we've had really good success, even in this year of pandemic, with folks who've been interested in adopting these horses. So that's been a good program there. So we feel like we're trying to create that balance, and I know there are those who think, wow, there's still too many horses out on the range, and there are per our AML, but there's certainly others on the other side who think, we can't have enough of these. So we try to weave through that balance, as you described. That's one of those difficult situations. And certainly we don't have natural predation on the landscape, so they pretty much have uninhibited growth. So that's what causes us, and through, again, decades of processes and planning, we have an ability to go out and capture some of those animals in a humane way, bring those in, and some are adopted out and some are left on permanent facilities where they're humanely continue through their lives.
Is that in the long term? Do you think that's tenable, or are we going to have to look at doing something else?
It's a challenge, and how we try to avoid this sort of increases of animals that are under the care of the federal government. Some of that's with a variety of birth control measures, or things where we can keep some horses on landscape, where we kind of slow that production rate down a little bit. I think that's a tool. I don't know if in the end that solves all of the problems, but certainly can maybe slow that rate. But ultimately, these are some decisions that our public and Congress are going to have to make of, what do you want this program to look like? And for now, I think we sort of have funding and a framework that we operate in with that, and will continue to do so.
Let's turn our attention to wildfires. This obviously, with our neighbor who's up airshed from us, California, it's just been a horrible year for wildfires. I'd like to address something that kind of happened under your watch before you left in your state capacity here, and what kind of impacts that has for expanding that onto federal lands, and that's the watershed restoration initiative that's been underway. And what is the BLM looking for, and what are the state goals to try to improve habitat and reduce fire risk?
Sure. Thank you, Chad. That's a good question and an important question, I think, for the citizens of the state, is to understand, how are we managing these landscapes for fuel load for fire. This year has been a huge year. Utah has had more than 1,300 fires this year, which is the record number, highest ever recorded. more than 1,000 of those have been man-caused, right? And that's a record number too. Thankfully, we have really a tremendous team here at the Utah Bureau of Land Management and partners who work with us, and we were able to really control a lot of this. Even though it's the most we've had, it certainly isn't the most acres that we've lost in the state over the years. So just a phenomenal job by the Utah BLM team to help keep these suppressed and out as quickly as possible. But how do we move forward? I think that's what you're saying is, what is a solution? And this Utah Watershed Restoration Initiative that's really under the leadership of the Utah Department of Natural Resources, that's kind of implemented by the Division of Wildlife Resources, where I came from. But the largest funding contributor to that program is the Utah Bureau of Land Management. There's other partners. There's the Forest Service. There's many small organizations, nonprofits, local. But this is allowing us to pour money into the landscape to do fuel treatments, to do restoration work, to try to improve these fuel loads and different plant communities to reduce or eliminate fires. And I think it's succeeding. It's been around for about not quite 20 years, and what we've seen in many cases is we've seen where we've had these treatment areas, a fire maybe that burns up to those, and because of a change in plant regime or how these fuels have been, it can come literally at times to a stop right in these areas. So I think it's being effective. I think it's a good use of tax dollars and of resources.
Let's talk about some of the other side benefits of that too, because it definitely changes the landscape. And I think of Scoot-and-Paw Road in Kane County. If you would have gone down that road 5-6 years ago, you would have been surrounded by pinyon juniper. You couldn't see anything. And they did some of that vegetation treatment there. Now you can see the pink cliffs on the boundaries of Bryce Canyon, and it just looks much more inviting.
Not everyone agrees that this is the right thing to do with on these landscapes, certainly, but I think what we do know is that in many cases, hopefully in most cases, it's not creating too much of a disturbance, but maybe at times an improvement of viewshed. But maybe more importantly, again, is helping bring back some of our water sources that are important and increasing the drainages, because we have a different plant community on those hillsides. And again, those fuels, those things that you mentioned, some of the pinyon juniper that maybe were blocking views of some, but there are also areas where they potentially were allowed for interruptions of fire that maybe could get away from us and that we couldn't control well. And we've had some of that in years past here in the state, and we could point to numerous examples. So hopefully we're eliminating, and we're looking forward down the road as we work these efforts.
Excellent. Well, we're going to take a break. We'll come back in just a minute, and we'll continue our conversation on the county seat. Welcome back to the county seat. Our conversation with the State Director of the Bureau of Land Management, Greg Sheehan, a native Utahn, and somebody that we've had a long friendship with. Greg, what are your priorities for going forward with the Bureau of Land Management?
I think we've already talked in your show here today about the multiple uses we have. And I think obviously we need to continue working those. But I think one area that we've seen that's really taken everyone off guard a little bit is as we've entered into this or gone through this pandemic year, what we've seen is this massive pulse of individuals go to visit our public lands. And I kind of term it as maybe a glimpse into the future, which is, we knew we were kind of having this growth, and then all of a sudden we jumped way up here. And what's interesting about that is a lot of that growth, much exceeding what we've seen in past years, isn't even from those who are coming in from foreign countries or different parts of the United States. Just that increase has been simply with people that are in Utah or close proximity. So when we talk about priorities, we have got to, as an organization here, as the Utah BLM and other states who are confronted with this, figure out how do we best manage all this this pulse of, or this increase of public on our public lands, and that's those who want to backpack. That's those who want to do mountain biking. That's those who want to do camping with their campers. It's those who have ATVs and side-by-sides and horseback. All of this use. And, are we best accommodating that well? Have we got places for people to safely park? Have we got places for those who need restroom facilities? Are we talking about the near country, right? Short hikes and areas that people could visit versus the far country, the deep country? And as we have more people, I've met with the sheriffs around the state. Search and rescue is a big issue for them. It's been a big demand on them as these people who are not familiar with these places get back and they get lost and they really don't have a lot of time. So necessarily to detract away, but they do it. They do it well, and we're appreciative of that. But we've got to continue to figure out how we adapt to all these public on our lands.
Is that an infrastructure load of actually taking a challenge to develop some infrastructure?
It is, and we just had this year the Great American Outdoors Act was passed, and it gives us some money through the Land and Wildlife Conservation Fund to get out onto these landscapes and create some of these things or improve our roads and some of these things that are out there now. So I think it's a great opportunity, and I think we're going to see a lot of good things come. And I hope we can do that working with local counties, with our different organizations out there to make sure we do this in a proper balance and use that Land and Water Conservation Fund in the right way to help our public.
Excellent. That sounds like a conversation that we should take up at your leisure sometime. So I'm going to throw out an invitation for you to come talk on that.
I'd love to. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you for taking the time with us today. Thank you for tuning into the County Seat. Remember, local government is where your life happens. Be involved. Be part of the solution. Share this with your friends. Chat with us on social media about this, and we'll look for you next week on the County Seat.
Thank you for watching the County Seat. Be sure to subscribe and turn on your notifications to keep up to date on the program and happenings around Utah.